Little Ponca girl chased the wild Mare at dawn. What she found in the Badlands shocked everyone and changed the fate of 37 souls who had been given up for dead. The Nebraska Territory, late summer of 1867, where the endless prairie. Grass swayed like an ocean of gold beneath the pale morning sky, and the wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain across the rolling hills that stretched beyond the horizon. The Ponca village sat nestled in a protected valley along the Niobrara River, its tipis arranged in a sacred circle that had been home to generations of families who lived in harmony with the rhythm of the seasons and the ancient ways past. Down through countless storytellers around winter fires, 12-year-old Enola Many Horses knelt beside the river's edge, her small hands working efficiently as she filled the family's water vessels with the clear, cold water that bubbled over. Smooth stones worn smooth by countless years of patient flow. Her long black hair hung in two neat braids, decorated with small beads her grandmother had given her the previous winter, and her buckskin dress, carefully crafted by her mother's skilled hands, moved gracefully as she worked in the quiet morning.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Enola was known throughout the village for her unusual connection with horses, a gift that had manifested when she was barely old enough to walk, and had only grown stronger with each passing season. While other children her age spent their mornings helping with daily chores, or learning traditional crafts from their elders, Enola could often be found at the edge of the village horse herd, communicating with the animals in ways that mystified even the most experienced horsemen among her people. Her father, Standing Bear Many Horses, was the village's most respected horse trainer, a man whose reputation for understanding these magnificent creatures had spread far beyond their small community to other tribes and even to some of the white settlements that had begun appearing along the river valleys. From him, Enola had learned not just the practical skills of horsemanship, but the deeper spiritual connection that existed between human and horse, the silent language of trust and respect that could bridge the gap between two very different kinds of beings. Her mother, Morning Star, was a medicine woman whose knowledge of healing herbs and sacred ceremonies made her invaluable to their community, and from her, Enola had inherited an intuitive understanding of the natural world that allowed her to read signs and patterns that others might miss entirely. It was this combination of her father's horse wisdom and her mother's spiritual insight that made Enola uniquely suited for what was about to unfold in the Badlands, beyond their peaceful valley. This particular morning felt different from the moment Enola opened her eyes in the dim light before dawn, as if the very air itself was charged with an energy she couldn't quite identify, but that made her skin tingle with anticipation. She had dreamed of horses running across an endless landscape, their hoofbeats creating a rhythm that seemed to call her name, and when she woke, the dream felt more like a memory than something her sleeping mind had created. The sensation was so powerful that she had risen before the rest of her family, drawn to complete her morning chores and step outside into the cool air where she could breathe deeply and try to understand what her dreams were trying to tell her. As she finished filling the water vessels, a sound drifted across the prairie that made her freeze in place, her heart suddenly beating faster as she recognized something that shouldn't have been possible. It was the sound of a horse's whinny, but not from their village herd, which grazed peacefully in the protected meadow on the other side of the settlement. This call came from the wild lands beyond, from the direction of the Badlands where her people rarely ventured except for vision quests and sacred ceremonies. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a kind of urgency that seemed to speak directly to something deep in Enola's soul. Enola stood slowly, setting down the water containers and turning toward the sound with the kind of focused attention her father had taught her to use when tracking animals through difficult terrain. The whinny came again, and this time she could hear something in it that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name, a kind of desperate urgency that seemed to be calling specifically to her. It was as if the horse was speaking, her name in a language only she could understand, beckoning her toward something that lay beyond the safety of the village. Without conscious thought, she found herself walking toward the edge of the village, her bare feet moving silently across the dew-dampened grass as she followed an instinct that felt as natural as breathing. The sound came a third time, and now she could see its source, a sight that made her gasp with wonder and disbelief. The morning mist was just beginning to lift from the prairie, and silhouetted against the pale sky was a figure that seemed to have stepped out of one of her grandmother's most magical stories. Standing on a ridge perhaps half a mile away was the most magnificent horse she had ever seen, a wild Mare whose coat gleamed like polished copper in the early morning light. The animal was larger than the horses in their village herd, with a proud bearing and an untamed beauty that spoke of a life lived completely free, answerable to no human master. Her mane flowed like liquid fire in the wind, and her eyes, even at this distance, seemed to hold an intelligence that was almost human in its intensity. Everything about the Mare spoke of power and grace, of a creature that belonged to the wild places where the spirits still walked freely. The Mare stood perfectly still for a long moment, as if waiting for Enola to notice her, and then she whinnied again, a sound so clear and compelling that it seemed to resonate in Enola's very bones. It was a call that spoke of urgency and need, of something important that required immediate attention. Then, without warning, the magnificent creature turned and began to gallop away from the village, heading directly toward the Badlands with a speed and grace that took Enola's breath away. But even as she ran, the Mare would pause every few hundred yards, looking back over her shoulder as if to make sure Enola understood that she was meant to follow. Every rational part of Enola's mind told her to return to the village, to tell her parents about the strange Mare and let the adults decide what, if anything, should be done about it. The Badlands were dangerous territory, full of hidden canyons, unstable rock formations, and predators that could kill an unwary traveler. More importantly, her people had strict rules about children wandering away from the village alone, especially young girls who might encounter threats they weren't equipped to handle. She could already imagine her father's stern disapproval and her mother's worried scolding if they discovered she had even contemplated such a foolish adventure. But something deeper than rational thought was driving Enola now, a certainty that felt like it came from the same source as her ability to communicate with horses. The Mare hadn't appeared by accident, and her behavior wasn't random. She was trying to lead Enola somewhere, trying to show her something that was important, enough to risk drawing a human child into the dangerous Badlands. The pull she felt was stronger than gravity, more compelling than hunger or thirst, and it seemed to bypass her conscious mind entirely to speak directly to her heart. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, Enola began to run, her strong, young legs carrying her swiftly across the prairie grass as she followed the path the Mare had taken. Behind her, the village was beginning to stir with the normal activities of morning, and she knew it wouldn't be long before her absence was noticed. But the pull she felt toward the retreating horse was stronger than her fear of punishment, stronger than her understanding of the dangers that lay ahead. It was as if an invisible cord connected her to the copper-colored Mare, and that cord was drawing her inexorably toward whatever lay waiting in the Badlands. The Mare seemed to sense that Enola was following because she would occasionally pause on high ground, looking back to make sure her human pursuer was still behind her, before continuing her relentless journey toward the heart of the Badlands. The pace was challenging, but not impossible, as if the horse understood exactly how fast a 12-year-old girl could run without exhausting herself. It was a test of endurance and determination, but one that Enola felt perfectly capable of meeting. Her body had been conditioned by years of helping with the horses, of running across the prairie during games with other children, of participating in the traditional dances that required both grace and stamina as the sun climbed higher in.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The sky, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Enola found herself entering terrain she had never seen before, even on the longest hunting expeditions with her father and the other men of the village. The gentle rolling hills of the prairie gave way to more rugged country, where wind and water had carved fantastic formations from the red and gray stone, creating a landscape that seemed almost otherworldly in its strange beauty. Rock spires twisted toward the sky like frozen dancers, and deep canyons cut through the earth like scars left by some ancient battle between earth and sky. The Mare led her through narrow passages between towering rock walls, across shallow streams that tasted of minerals and ancient stone, and up steep trails that required all of Enola's strength and agility to navigate safely. Several times she wondered if she should turn back, especially when the path became so treacherous that one wrong step could send her tumbling into a canyon far below. But each time doubt crept into her mind, the Mare would appear again, her copper coat gleaming in the sunlight, and Enola would find the courage to continue. The horse seemed to know exactly where to place her hooves, exactly which paths were safe and which were not. The landscape around her grew increasingly dramatic as they penetrated deeper into the Badlands, with strange rock formations that looked like the work of giants and valleys so deep and narrow that they remained in perpetual shadow even at midday. The air itself felt different here, thinner and charged with an energy that made her skin prickle and her hair stand on end. This was a place of power, she realized, the kind of sacred space where the spirits of the earth were particularly close to the surface. Her grandmother had told her stories of such places, locations where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world grew thin. The sun was approaching its highest point in the sky when Enola began to notice something that made her step falter with surprise and growing concern. Mixed with the natural sense of sage and stone was another smell, one that didn't belong in this wild place. It was the smell of wood smoke, but not the clean, sweet smoke of her people's fires. This smoke carried undertones of char and destruction, the acrid scent of things that had burned when they weren't meant to burn. It was the smell of tragedy, of violence, of lives that had been torn apart by forces beyond their control. The Mare had stopped again, standing on a promontory that overlooked a hidden valley Enola hadn't even known existed. From this vantage point, she could see the source of the smoke, and the sight made her heart clench with horror and disbelief. Scattered across the valley floor were the burned remains of what had once been a wagon train, the blackened skeletons of covered wagons, standing like monuments to some terrible tragedy. The canvas tops had been burned away, leaving only the charred wooden frames, and scattered around them were the remnants of lives that had been suddenly and violently interrupted. But it was what she saw moving among the ruins that made Enola gasp aloud and press her hand to her mouth in shock. There were people down there, survivors who were somehow still alive weeks after the attack that everyone in the territory had heard about but assumed had left no witnesses. Men, women, and children were moving slowly among the wreckage, and even from this distance, Enola could see that they were in desperate condition. Their movements were slow and labored, the movements of people who had been pushed to the very limits of human endurance. The Hartwell wagon train had been the talk of every settlement and Indian village for miles around when news of the attack had first spread across the territory. 37 souls, the reports had said, traveling from Missouri to Oregon with everything they owned packed into 12 wagons. They had been attacked by a band of renegades, both white outlaws and rogue Indians from various tribes somewhere in the Badlands where their bodies would never be found and their fate would remain a mystery. Search parties had looked for them for weeks, but the Badlands were vast and treacherous, and eventually the searches had been called off, or so everyone had believed. But here, in this hidden valley that could only be reached by following paths that few humans had ever discovered, were the survivors of that attack, still alive but clearly hanging on to life by the thinnest of threads. Enola could see that they had managed to salvage some supplies from the burned wagons, and they had constructed crude shelters from salvaged wood and canvas, but their condition was obviously desperate. Some of them appeared to be injured, moving with the careful gait of people nursing wounds, while others seemed to be suffering from illness or exhaustion. The Mare whinnied softly, a sound that seemed to say, "This is why I brought you here. This is what you needed to see." And as Enola watched the survivors struggling to survive in their hidden refuge, she understood that she was witnessing something that would change not just her own life, but the fate of everyone in that valley. These people needed help desperately. And through some miracle of communication between horse and human, she had been chosen to find them. The Mare had somehow known they were here, had somehow understood that Enola was the one person who might be able to bridge the gap between two worlds and bring salvation to the desperate survivors. But even as her heart filled with compassion for the suffering people below, Enola's mind began to race with the complexity of what she had discovered. These were white settlers, people whose relationship with her tribe was complicated at best, and openly hostile at worst. There were members of her own village who had lost family members to white soldiers and settlers, and there were white communities that viewed all Indians as potential threats to be eliminated or driven away. The very fact that she was here, that she had discovered these survivors, could be seen as either a blessing or a curse depending on who was making the judgment. Moreover, whoever had attacked this wagon train might still be in the area, and if they discovered that there were survivors, they would undoubtedly return to finish what they had started. By helping these people, Enola might be putting not just herself but her entire village in danger from the same renegades who had perpetrated this attack. The weight of responsibility settled on her young shoulders like a physical burden, and for the first time since she had begun following the Mare, she felt truly afraid. The copper Mare turned her magnificent head toward Enola and released a sound unlike any hoarse call she had ever heard before. It was low and rumbling, almost like a purr, but filled with an urgency that made every nerve in Enola's body snap to attention. The horse's intelligent eyes seemed to bore into her soul, and in that moment, Enola understood with crystal clarity that this was no ordinary animal, but a messenger from the spirit world itself, sent to guide her toward a destiny she could never have imagined. The Mare's entire bearing spoke of ancient wisdom and supernatural purpose, as if she had been walking between the world of spirits and the world of flesh for longer than any living creature should be able to exist. Without hesitation, the Mare began picking her way down the treacherous slope that led into the hidden valley, her hooves finding purchase on rocks that looked too small and unstable to support even a child's weight. Enola watched in amazement as the horse descended, with supernatural grace, never once slipping or stumbling despite the obvious dangers of the terrain. It was as if the Mare knew exactly where every safe foothold lay, as if she had traveled this path many times before in preparation for this very moment. The way she moved was almost ethereal, her copper coat catching the light in ways that made her seem to glow against the dark stone of the canyon walls. Enola took a deep breath and began her own descent, following the path the Mare had taken, but moving much more slowly and carefully than her four-legged guide. The rocks were loose and crumbling, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, and more than once she felt her foot slip, just as she was putting her full weight on what she had thought was a secure hold. The sound of falling stones echoed through the valley below, and she winced each time, knowing that any loud noise might alert the survivors to her presence before she was ready to reveal herself. Her heart pounded with each precarious step, and she found herself whispering prayers to her ancestors for protection and guidance. The descent took nearly an hour, with Enola having to backtrack several times when she encountered sections of the cliff face that were too dangerous to navigate. Her hands became scraped and bloody from gripping the rough stone, and her buckskin dress caught on sharp protrusions, tearing in several places. But with each careful step downward, she could see more details of the scene below, and what she observed filled her with both admiration and heartbreak for these people, who had somehow managed to survive in this desolate place. As she descended, Enola began to make out more details of the scene below, and what she saw made her heart ache with sympathy and admiration for these people, who had somehow managed to survive in this desolate place. The survivors had clearly been incredibly resourceful, using every scrap of salvageable material from their destroyed wagons to create a makeshift camp that provided at least minimal shelter from the elements. Canvas had been stretched between the burned wagon frames to create lean-to shelters, and she could see that they had managed to salvage some cooking pots and other essential supplies. Pieces of metal from the wagon wheels had been fashioned into crude tools, and she could see evidence of small fires where they had been cooking whatever meager food they had managed to find or preserve. But it was also clear that their situation was becoming increasingly desperate with each passing day. Even from her elevated position, Enola could see that several of the people moving around the camp were obviously weakened by hunger and illness. An older woman sat on a makeshift stool fashioned from a wagon wheel and a piece of canvas, her head hanging with exhaustion, while a man with a blood-stained bandage around his head moved with the careful, deliberate motions of someone nursing a serious injury. Near one of the shelters, a young mother held a baby close to her chest, rocking back and forth in the universal motion of a parent trying to soothe a crying child. But even from a distance, Enola could see that the woman's face was gaunt with hunger and worry. The Mare had reached the valley floor and was now standing at the edge of the survivors' camp, her presence causing a stir among the desperate people. Enola could hear voices carried on the wind, excited exclamations as the survivors noticed the beautiful horse. Several of the men were approaching the Mare cautiously, clearly hoping to catch her, probably thinking that a horse might be there. Salvation, their ticket out of this hidden valley and back to civilization. She could hear one of them saying, "Easy there, girl. We're not going to hurt you. We just need your help." But the Mare was too clever for them. She allowed the men to get within a few feet before dancing away with fluid grace, always staying just out of reach but never moving so far that she disappeared entirely. It was as if she was keeping their attention, drawing them away from the camp and toward the base of the cliff where Enola was still making her way down. The horse was creating a distraction, Enola realized, giving her time to reach the valley floor without being spotted by the survivors. Every movement the Mare made seemed calculated and purposeful, as if she was executing a plan that had been carefully thought out in advance. When Enola finally reached the bottom of the cliff, her hands were scraped and bleeding from gripping the rough stone, and her buckskin dress was torn in several places from catching on sharp rocks during her descent. But she felt a surge of pride at having successfully navigated such dangerous terrain, and she knew that her father would be impressed by her climbing skills, even if he would be furious about the circumstances that had required them. The valley floor was covered with loose shale and scattered boulders, making it difficult to move quietly, but Enola had learned stealth from her father's hunting lessons, and she managed to pick her way carefully toward the camp without making too much noise. The Mare immediately trotted over to her, nuzzling her shoulder with a gentleness that seemed almost human in its affection. Up close, the horse was even more magnificent than she had appeared from a distance. Her coat gleamed like burnished copper, and her mane was so soft and silky that it felt like flowing water beneath Enola's fingers. But it was the horse's eyes that truly took her breath away. They were the deepest brown she had ever seen, filled with an intelligence and wisdom that seemed ancient, as if this creature had witnessed countless generations of human joy and sorrow. When she looked into those eyes, Enola felt as if she was looking into the heart of the natural world itself. "You brought me here for a reason," Enola whispered to the Mare, stroking her neck with reverent hands. "But I don't know what I'm supposed to do? I'm just a child, and these people need more help than I can give them." The Mare whinnied softly in response, a sound that somehow conveyed both understanding and encouragement, as if she was telling Enola to trust in her own abilities and in the wisdom of the spirits that had guided them both to this place. The horse's warm breath tickled her ear as she leaned in close, and Enola felt a strange sense of comfort and strength flowing from the animal into her own body. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Enola began moving toward the survivors' camp, keeping to the shadows cast by the canyon walls and using every stealth technique her father had taught her during their hunting expeditions. She needed to get close enough to assess the situation properly, to understand exactly what these people needed and how dire their circumstances truly were, before she revealed herself and tried to communicate with them. The ground was treacherous, covered with loose rocks that could betray her presence with a single misstep, but she moved with the silent grace her people had perfected over generations of hunting in difficult terrain. As she crept closer to the makeshift shelters, Enola began to overhear fragments of conversation that painted a clearer picture of the survivor's ordeal. A man with graying hair and tired eyes was speaking quietly to a younger woman, his voice heavy with despair. "We can't last much longer, Sarah. The children are getting weaker every day, and we're down to our last few handfuls of grain. If someone doesn't find us soon, we're going to start losing people. Little Annie hasn't eaten a full meal in 3 days, and old Mrs. Patterson can barely stand up anymore." The woman addressed as Sarah nodded grimly, her own face gaunt with hunger and worry. "I know, Henry, but we can't give up hope. We've survived this long because we've stuck together and refused to despair. We have to believe that help is coming, somehow, from somewhere. Maybe God sent us to this hidden place for a reason. Maybe He's testing our faith, seeing if we're strong enough to deserve salvation." Her voice carried the kind of determined optimism that people cling to in their darkest moments, when faith is all that stands between them and complete despair. From another shelter came the sound of someone coughing, a harsh, rattling sound that spoke of serious illness. Enola peered through a gap in the canvas and saw a middle-aged man lying on a makeshift bed constructed from salvaged wagon boards and whatever fabric they had been able to recover. His face was flushed with fever and his breathing labored, and she could see dark stains on the cloth covering his chest that suggested he was coughing up blood. A woman who appeared to be his wife was bathing his forehead with a damp cloth, her movements gentle but her expression filled with fear and helplessness. It was clear that the man was seriously ill, possibly dying, and that they had no medicine or means to treat him properly. Near the center of the camp, a group of children sat in a circle, their clothes torn and dirty, their faces thin and pale from hunger. Despite their obvious suffering, they were playing a quiet game with small stones they had gathered, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in their desperate situation. Enola's heart went out to them, recognizing in their bravery the same kind of resilience that her own people had always admired. These children were facing circumstances that would have broken many adults, yet they were still finding ways to comfort each other and hold on to hope. One little girl, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, was telling a story to the others, her voice soft but animated as she wove a tale about brave princes and magical kingdoms. As she continued her careful observation of the camp, Enola began to piece together the full scope of the tragedy that had befallen the Hartwell wagon train. From the conversations she overheard and the evidence scattered around the camp, it became clear that the attack had been sudden and devastating. The survivors spoke in hushed tones about family members and friends who had been killed in the initial assault, about the terrifying flight into the Badlands as they tried to escape their attackers, and about the desperate days that followed as they tried to create some kind of shelter in this hidden valley. She heard names mentioned with grief and longing, stories of parents who had died protecting their children, of husbands who had fallen while defending their families, of entire families that had been wiped out in the space of a few terrible hours, but it was also becoming clear that their ordeal was far from over. One of the men was speaking urgently to a small group gathered near the remains of what had once been the lead wagon. "I'm telling you, they're still out there," he was saying, his voice tight with fear. "I saw smoke signals 2 days ago, coming from the ridge to the north. They're looking for us, and it's only a matter of time before they find this place. We need to be ready to run again if we have to, but I don't know how much farther we can go. Half the people in this camp can barely walk, and we don't have supplies for another journey." The revelation that their attackers were still hunting them sent a chill down Enola's spine. She had been so focused on the immediate problem of the survivors' desperate condition that she hadn't fully considered the ongoing danger they faced. If the renegades who had attacked the wagon train were still in the area, actively searching for survivors, then any rescue attempt would be incredibly dangerous. Not only would she be putting herself at risk, but she might also be leading the attackers directly to her own village. The thought of bringing violence and death to her peaceful people filled her with terror, but the alternative of leaving these innocent souls to die seemed equally unthinkable. Despite the danger, Enola felt her resolve strengthening as she watched these brave people struggling to survive against impossible odds. They had lost everything, had watched friends and family members die, had been driven into one of the most inhospitable places on earth, yet they were still fighting to stay alive, still caring for each other, still refusing to give up hope. There was something profoundly moving about their courage and determination, something that spoke to the deepest values her parents had taught her about the importance of helping those in need. Regardless of their race or background, the Mare had been grazing quietly nearby, somehow finding enough vegetation among the rocks to sustain herself. But now she approached Enola again, nuzzling her shoulder and looking toward the camp with what seemed like expectation. It was clear that the horse had brought her here not just to observe, but to act. The question was how a 12-year-old Ponca girl could possibly help 37 desperate survivors, without putting everyone involved in even greater danger. She felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden, and for a moment she was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being asked of her. As if in response to her thoughts, Enola heard a commotion from the Chico other side of the camp. Several of the men were shouting excitedly, and she could see them pointing towards something she couldn't see from her current position. Moving carefully to get a better view, she discovered that they had found something in one of the burned wagons, something that had survived the fire and might be useful for their survival. The excitement in their voices was the first genuine hope she had heard since arriving in the valley. "It's a medicine chest," one of the men was saying, his voice filled with relief and hope. "Doc Morrison's medical supplies. Most of it's damaged, but there might be something we can use." He was pulling bottles and packages from a partially burned wooden box, examining each item carefully to see if it had survived the fire intact. Several of the containers were cracked or melted, their contents ruined, but a few appeared to be undamaged. "Look here, there's laudanum for pain and quinine for fever. This bottle of carbolic acid is still good. We can use it to clean wounds." The discovery of the medical supplies seemed to energize the entire camp. The woman who had been caring for the sick man hurried over to examine what had been salvaged, her face lighting up with hope as she identified several bottles of medicine that might help her husband. Other survivors gathered around, talking excitedly about how the medicines might be used to treat various ailments and injuries that had been plaguing them since the attack. For the first time since Enola had been observing them, she saw genuine smiles on their faces, heard laughter mixed with their voices, but even as the survivors celebrated their good fortune, Enola could see that their problems were far from solved. The medicine chest might help them treat some of their sick and injured, but it didn't address their fundamental problems of food, shelter, and the ongoing threat from their attackers. They were still trapped in a hidden valley with limited supplies. still at risk of being discovered by the people who had tried to kill them, still facing the slow death of starvation if they remained where they were. The medicines might buy them a little more time, but they weren't a permanent solution to their desperate situation. As she watched the survivors examining their newfound medical supplies, Enola made a decision that would change the course of all their lives. She couldn't abandon these people to their fate, couldn't simply return to her village and pretend she had never seen their suffering. The spirit horse had brought her here for a reason, and that reason was clearly to help these desperate souls find a way to survive. Whatever the risks, whatever the complications that might arise from contact between her people and the white survivors, she had to find a way to bridge the gap between two worlds and bring help to those who needed it most. The Mare seemed to sense her decision, whinnying softly and tossing her magnificent head as if in approval. Together, they had descended into the shadows of the hidden valley and discovered a secret that would test every value. Enola had been taught about courage, compassion, and the sacred duty to help those in need. Now came the truly difficult part, figuring out how to turn that discovery into salvation for 37 desperate people who had been given up for dead by the rest of the world. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, Enola knew that time was running out. Every moment she delayed was another moment of suffering for the survivors, another opportunity for their attackers to discover their hiding place, another step closer to a tragedy that would haunt the Badlands forever. The Copper Mare had shown her the problem, but now it was up to her to find the solution, and she had no idea where to begin. Enola crouched behind a large boulder at the edge of the survivors' camp, her heart hammering against her ribs as she wrestled with the most important decision of her young life. The Copper Mare stood beside her, somehow managing to remain completely invisible to the settlers despite being only 50 yards away from their makeshift shelters. The horse's supernatural ability to avoid detection convinced Enola more than ever that this creature was no ordinary animal, but a spirit guide sent to help her navigate the treacherous path that lay ahead. The sounds of the camp washed over her in waves. She could hear the sick man's labored breathing, punctuated by harsh coughs that echoed off the canyon walls. Children's voices rose and fell as they played their quiet games, their laughter tinged with a brittle quality that spoke of hunger and fear barely held in check. Adults moved about with the efficient desperation of people who knew that every action might mean the difference between life and death for their families. But it was the conversation she overheard between two of the men that finally pushed Enola past the point of hesitation. They were standing near the burned remains of the lead wagon, their voices low but carrying clearly in the still air of the hidden valley. "We're not going to make it another week, Jacob," one of them was saying, a tall man with a bandaged arm who moved with obvious pain. "The children are starting to show signs of real starvation, and Martha's baby hasn't stopped crying for 2 days straight. That little one needs milk, and Martha's not producing enough anymore because she's not eating enough herself." The man called Jacob, an older fellow with gray hair and a beard that had grown wild and unkempt during their ordeal, nodded grimly as he surveyed the camp. "I know, Samuel. I've been thinking the same thing. We've got maybe 3 days of food left if we stretch it, and that's counting the bark soup and whatever edible plants we can find. But there's something else we need to talk about." He paused, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I found fresh horse tracks this morning, about a mile north of here. Shod horses, riding in formation. That's not wild mustangs, Samuel. That's riders, and given our situation, I don't think they're friendly." The revelation that their attackers might be closing in sent a chill through Enola's entire body. The survivors weren't just facing starvation and illness. They were still being hunted by the same renegades who had destroyed their wagon train and murdered their friends and family members. The urgency of their situation suddenly became crystal clear to her. These people didn't have days or weeks to wait for rescue. They might not even have hours if their enemies found this hidden valley. Samuel's face went pale beneath his sun-weathered skin. How close were the tracks? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Could they have seen our smoke? Jacob shook his head, but his expression remained grim. The tracks were old, maybe a day or two. But they were definitely searching, riding in a grid pattern like they were looking for something specific. It's only a matter of time before they work. They're way down to this valley, and when they do, we'll be sitting ducks. We can't fight them, not in our condition, and we can't run far enough or fast enough to escape them. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their impossible situation settling over them like a suffocating blanket. Finally, Samuel spoke again, his voice heavy with despair. Maybe we should send someone out tonight. Try to get word to the nearest settlement. It's a long shot, but if we could get a message to the cavalry post at Fort Robinson, maybe they could send a patrol. Jacob considered this for a moment before shaking his head. It's a 3-day ride to Fort Robinson for a healthy man on a good horse. None of us are in any condition to make that journey, and we don't have any horses left. Whoever we sent would be walking into certain death. Enola felt tears stinging her eyes as she listened to these desperate men trying to find hope in a hopeless situation. They were good people, she could tell, people who had been traveling west with dreams of a better life, only to have those dreams shattered by violence and cruelty. Now they were trapped in this hidden valley, slowly dying of hunger and exposure, while their enemies closed in around them like wolves circling wounded prey. The copper Mare nudged her shoulder gently, and when Enola looked into those ancient, knowing eyes, she saw something that strengthened her resolve. The horse was telling her that the time for hiding and hesitation was over. These people needed help, and she was the only one who could provide it. The Mare had brought her here for this exact moment, and no matter how frightened she was, no matter how impossible the task seemed, she had to act, taking a deep breath that felt like it might be her last as an anonymous observer. Enola stood up from behind the boulder and stepped into the open area at the edge of the camp. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The closest survivor, a woman who had been hanging wet clothing on a makeshift line, caught sight of her and let out a sharp cry of surprise. "There's someone here," she called out, her voice carrying a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Child, there's an Indian child here." Within moments, every person in the camp who was capable of moving had gathered around Enola, their faces showing a kaleidoscope of emotions. Some looked fearful, remembering that their attackers had included rogue Indians among their number. Others showed curiosity, wonder at the appearance of this young girl in their hidden refuge. But most displayed the desperate hope of people who had been praying for salvation and suddenly found themselves face to face with something that might represent an answer to their prayers. The first person to speak was an older woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Despite the obvious hardship she had endured, there was a maternal warmth in her voice that reminded Enola of her own grandmother. "Hello, child," she said gently, taking a careful step forward. "My name is Martha Thompson. Can you understand me? Do you speak English?" Her tone was respectful and non-threatening, the voice of someone who understood that first impressions could mean the difference between help and hostility. Enola had learned English from traders who occasionally visited her village, and while she wasn't fluent, she could communicate well enough to make herself understood. "I speak English," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "My name is Enola Many Horses. I am Ponca." The simple introduction seemed to break some invisible barrier, and she could see several of the survivors relaxing slightly. The fact that she could communicate with them had transformed her from a potential threat into a potential lifeline. A man stepped forward from the group, the same Jacob who had been discussing their dire situation with Samuel just moments before. His weathered face showed a mixture of hope and wariness as he studied Enola carefully. Enola many horses, he repeated, as if testing the sound of her name. That's a beautiful name, child. I'm Jacob Hartwell, and these are the survivors of my wagon train. We've been trapped here for weeks, and we're in desperate need of help. Can you tell us how you found us? Are there others with you? Enola glanced back toward where the copper Mare stood, still somehow invisible to the settlers despite being in plain sight. The horse nodded almost imperceptibly, as if giving her permission to tell the truth. A horse brought me here, she said simply. A copper-colored Mare. She led me from my village to this place. I think she wanted me to find you. The explanation sounded strange even to her own ears, but it was the truth. And she had learned from her parents that honesty was usually the best foundation for trust. Several of the survivors exchanged glances, and Enola could see skepticism in their faces. The idea that a wild horse had somehow guided an Indian child to their hidden refuge probably seemed fantastical to people who were more accustomed to practical, everyday concerns. But Martha Thompson stepped forward again, her eyes bright with something that might have been understanding. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, she said softly. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and if He sent you to us through a horse, then I'm grateful for that horse. The mention of divine intervention seemed to resonate with many of the other survivors, and Enola could see some of the tension leaving their faces. These were people of faith, she realized. People who believed that God could work miracles through ordinary creatures and events. Her story about the spirit horse suddenly seemed less impossible and more like the kind of divine intervention they had been praying for during their darkest hours. A young woman stepped forward, holding a baby who was crying weakly in her arms. Enola could see immediately that both mother and child were suffering from malnutrition, their faces gaunt and their eyes sunken with hunger. Please, the woman said, her voice breaking with desperation. If you know where we can get help, if your people can spare any food or medicine, I'll do anything. My baby is dying, and I don't know how much longer any of us can last. The raw desperation in the young mother's voice hit Enola like a physical blow. This wasn't just about abstract concepts of helping strangers anymore. This was about saving the life of a baby who was slowly starving to death in her mother's arms. The weight of responsibility settled on Enola's shoulders, but instead of crushing her, it seemed to give her strength. She thought of her own mother's teachings about the sacred duty to protect children. Regardless of their tribe or background, I can help, Enola said, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. My village is not far from here. We have food, medicine, horses. But there are things we need to talk about first. You said your attackers are still looking for you. That means helping you could put my people in danger too. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing understanding and respect dawn in their eyes. They appreciated that she was being honest about the risks involved. Jacob nodded gravely, his respect for this young girl clearly growing. You're right to be concerned, Enola. The men who attacked us are ruthless killers. They murdered entire families, including children your age. If they found out that your people were helping us, they would probably attack your village too. We wouldn't want to bring that kind of danger to innocent people. His words carried the weight of a man who had seen too much violence and understood its terrible cost. But even as Jacob spoke about the dangers, Enola could see the desperate hope flickering in the eyes of every person around her. They understood the risks involved, but they also knew that they were facing certain death if they remained where they were. The baby in the young mother's arms let out another weak cry, and Enola felt her resolve harden into something unbreakable. Whatever the risks, whatever the complications, she couldn't walk away from these suffering people. There might be a way, she said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. My father is standing bare many horses. He is respected in our village and in other villages too. If I can convince him that helping you is the right thing to do, he might be able to organize the other men to provide protection as well as supplies. But first, I need to know more about who attacked you. If we're going to help, we need to know what we're facing." The request for information seemed to energize the survivors, and several of them began speaking at once, eager to share what they knew about their attackers. From their overlapping accounts, Enola began to piece together a picture of the renegade band that had destroyed the wagon train. It was a mixed group of white outlaws and Indian renegades from various tribes, led by a man the survivors knew only as Black Pete, a former cavalry scout who had turned to robbery and murder after being dishonorably discharged from the army. "There were maybe 20 of them when they hit us," Samuel explained, his face darkening with the memory. "They came at us just before dawn, when most of us were still sleeping. They had our camp surrounded before we even knew they were there. The fighting only lasted about an hour, but when it was over, half our people were dead and our wagons were burning." His voice carried the haunted quality of someone who had witnessed unthinkable violence. Martha Thompson stepped forward to continue the account, her voice steady despite the obvious pain of the memories. "Those of us who survived the initial attack managed to escape into the Badlands, but we were scattered and disorganized. It took us 2 days to find each other and make our way to this valley. We thought we were safe here, hidden away where no one would think to look for us. But now it sounds like they're still searching, still trying to finish what they started." As Enola listened to their accounts of the attack and their subsequent struggles to survive, she began to understand the full magnitude of what she was contemplating. This wasn't just about providing food and medicine to hungry people. This was about taking on a band of ruthless killers who had already proven they were willing to murder entire families without hesitation. If her village became involved in protecting these survivors, they would be making themselves targets for the same kind of violence. But even as the dangers became clearer, Enola found herself thinking about the values her parents had taught. Her people believed that all life was sacred, that protecting the innocent was one of the highest callings a person could answer. These survivors weren't responsible for the crimes of other white people, just as she wasn't responsible for the actions of rogue Indians. They were simply human beings in desperate need of help, and that was all that really mattered. The copper Mare suddenly appeared at Enola's side, materializing from seemingly nowhere to nuzzle her shoulder gently. This time, several of the survivors gasped in amazement as they finally saw the magnificent horse that had been invisible to them until this moment. "My God," whispered Jacob, his voice filled with awe. "Where did that horse come from? She's the most beautiful animal I've ever seen." Enola smiled for the first time since entering the camp, reaching up to stroke the Mare's silky neck. "This is the horse that led me to you," she explained. "I think she wants you to know that help is coming. But first, I need to return to my village and speak with my father and the other elders. I need to convince them that helping you is worth the risk." The young mother with the baby stepped forward again, tears streaming down her face. "How long will that take?" she asked desperately. "My baby can't wait much longer. None of us can." Enola looked at the crying infant, seeing in its tiny face a reflection of every child who had ever needed protection and care. "I'll ride through the night," she promised. "If I can convince my father, I'll return tomorrow with help. But you need to be ready to move quickly if necessary. Your enemies are getting closer, and this valley might not be safe much longer." As if to emphasize the urgency of the situation, the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, causing every person in the camp to freeze with terror. The sound was faint but unmistakable, and it was coming from the direction of the main trail into the Badlands. The renegades were still searching, still hunting for the survivors who had escaped their initial attack. The copper Mare whinnied softly and tossed her head toward the trail that led out of the valley, her message clear. It was time to go, time to race back to the Ponca village and begin the most important mission of Enola's young life. She had found the survivors, had made contact with them, and had promised them help. Now came the truly difficult part, convincing her own people to risk everything to save 37 strangers who had been given up for dead by the rest of the world. The copper Mare's hooves thundered across the prairie as she carried Enola through the darkening landscape, her supernatural speed making the journey back to the Ponca village feel like flying through a dream. The wind whipped through Enola's hair as she clung to the Mare's mane, her mind racing faster than the horse's powerful legs as she tried to formulate the words that would convince her people to risk everything for strangers. Behind them, the Badlands receded into shadow, but the memory of 37 desperate faces burned bright in Enola's heart, driving her forward with desperate urgency. As they approached the familiar outlines of her village, Enola could see the warm glow of cooking fires and hear the distant sounds of evening activities. Children were being called inside for supper. Elders were gathering to share stories and smoke their pipes, and the normal rhythm of Ponca life continued unchanged, blissfully unaware that their world was about to be turned upside down by a 12-year-old girl with an impossible request. The copper Mare slowed her pace as they reached the edge of the village, and Enola slipped from her back, her legs trembling not just from the hard ride, but from the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. The first person to spot her was her younger brother, Little Wolf, who had been playing with carved wooden horses near their family's tipi. His face lit up with relief and excitement when he saw her. "Enola, mother and father have been looking for you everywhere. They're very worried, and father is angry because you disappeared without telling anyone where you were going." His words carried the innocent concern of a child who couldn't imagine why his sister would cause such worry, but they also served as a reminder of the trouble she was already in before she even began to explain her extraordinary discovery. Enola knelt down and hugged her brother tightly, drawing strength from his familiar presence. "Little Wolf, I need you to run to father and tell him that I've returned safely, but that I need to speak with him and the other elders immediately. Tell him it's a matter of life and death, and that many people are depending on what happens next." The boy's eyes widened with the gravity of her words, and he nodded solemnly before racing off toward the center of the village where the men often gathered in the evenings. As Enola made her way through the village toward her family's dwelling, she was intercepted by her mother, Morning Star, whose face showed a mixture of relief and maternal fury that only a worried parent could display. "Enola, many horses, where have you been?" she demanded, pulling her daughter into a fierce embrace before holding her at arm's length to examine her for injuries. "Your father and I have been frantic with worry. You disappeared at dawn without a word, and when the sun began to set with no sign of you, we feared the worst." Looking into her mother's concerned face, Enola felt the full weight of what she had put her family through, and guilt washed over her like a cold wave. But there was no time for lengthy explanations or apologies, not when 37 lives hung in the balance and their enemies were closing in on their hidden refuge. "Mother, I'm sorry for worrying you, but I had to follow the spirit horse. She led me to people who desperately need our help, and I promised them I would return with aid. I need to speak with father and the council immediately." Morning Star's eyes narrowed as she studied her daughter's face, reading there the unmistakable signs of someone who had witnessed profound suffering and made life-changing promises. As a medicine woman, she had learned to recognize the look of someone who had been touched by the spirit world, and she could see that whatever had happened to Enola during her absence had transformed her from a child into something approaching an adult. "What kind of people?" she asked quietly, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "White settlers," Enola replied honestly, knowing that there was no point in trying to soften the revelation. "Survivors of a wagon train attack. They're trapped in the Badlands, starving and sick, with children and babies among them. Their attackers are still hunting them, and they'll all die if we don't help them." The words hung in the air between mother and daughter like a challenge, And Enola could see the conflict playing out in Morningstar's eyes as her natural compassion warred with her concern for her own people's safety. Before Morningstar could respond, standing bare, many horses appeared, striding toward them with the purposeful gait of a man who had been searching for his missing daughter for hours. His face showed relief at seeing Enola safe, but that relief was quickly replaced by stern disapproval as he took in her torn clothing and the obvious signs that she had been traveling in dangerous territory. "Daughter," he said, his voice carrying the authority of both a father and a respected leader, "you will explain yourself immediately. Your reckless behavior has caused great worry throughout the village." Enola squared her shoulders and met her father's gaze directly, drawing on every lesson he had taught her about courage and honesty. "Father, I followed a spirit horse into the Badlands, and she led me to survivors of the Hartwell wagon train. 37 people, including children and babies, are trapped in a hidden valley. They're starving, they're sick, and their attackers are still hunting them. They'll all die unless we help them, and I promised them I would return with aid." She delivered the information quickly and clearly, knowing that her father valued directness over elaborate explanations. Standing Bear's expression shifted from anger to amazement as he processed his daughter's words. The Hartwell wagon train attack had been discussed in their village when news of it first reached them, and like everyone else in the territory, he had assumed that all the travelers had been killed. The idea that there were survivors, and that his daughter had somehow found them, seemed almost impossible to believe. "You're certain of what you saw?" he asked, his voice taking on the careful tone of a man who understood that important decisions often hinged on accurate information. "I spoke with them, Father. I saw their suffering with my own eyes. There's a baby who's dying because his mother can't produce enough milk due to hunger. There's a sick man who might not survive another night without medicine. There are children who are slowly starving to death." Enola's voice grew stronger with each word, fueled by the memory of the desperate faces she had left behind. "The spirit horse brought me to them for a reason. We have the power to save them, but only if we act quickly." Standing Bear studied his daughter's face for a long moment, seeing there a determination and maturity that hadn't been present that morning. Whatever she had experienced in the Badlands had changed her, had given her a sense of purpose and responsibility that commanded respect even from a seasoned warrior and leader. "If what you say is true, then this is a matter for the entire council to decide. The risks are enormous, not just for those who would go to help, but for our entire village." Within an hour, the tribal council had assembled in the great lodge at the center of the village. The circular structure was filled with the most respected elders and warriors of the Ponca people, men and women whose wisdom and experience had guided the tribe through countless challenges over the years. The air was thick with sweet grass smoke and the weight of momentous decision-making as Enola stood in the center of the circle, preparing to make the most important speech of her life. Chief Spotted Eagle, a man whose age and wisdom were legendary among the Ponca, spoke first. His voice carried the gravity of someone who had lived through wars, famines, and the countless trials that had tested his people's strength and character. "Enola, many horses, your father tells us that you claim to have found survivors of the white settlers' wagon train that was attacked in the Badlands. This is a serious matter, and we must hear all the details before we can make any decisions." Enola took a deep breath and began to tell her story from the beginning, describing the appearance of the copper Mare, the long journey into the Badlands, and her discovery of the desperate survivors in their hidden valley. She spoke of the children who were slowly starving, the sick man who needed medicine, the young mother whose baby was dying in her arms. But she also spoke honestly about the dangers involved, about the renegade band that was still hunting the survivors and the risk that helping them might bring violence to the Ponca village. As she spoke, Enola could see different reactions playing out across the faces of the council members. Some showed compassion and concern for the suffering of innocent people. Others displayed worry about the potential consequences of getting involved in conflicts between white settlers and outlaw bands. A few seemed skeptical about her story altogether, finding it difficult to believe that a 12-year-old girl could have accomplished such an extraordinary feat. When Enola finished her account, the council fell silent for several minutes, each member contemplating the implications of what they had heard. Finally, War Chief Thunderhorse stood to speak, his massive frame and scarred face testament to a lifetime of battles fought to protect his people. "What this girl describes is both noble and dangerous," he said, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the lodge. "We all know the stories of white settlers who have taken our lands, who have broken treaties and driven our people from their ancestral homes. Why should we risk our lives and the safety of our families to help these particular whites?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Enola felt her heart sink as she realized that some members of the council viewed this as an issue of racial loyalty rather than human compassion. But before she could respond, an unexpected voice spoke up from the circle of elders. Grandmother Willow, the oldest and most respected woman in the village, slowly rose to her feet, her ancient eyes bright with wisdom and conviction. "I have lived through many seasons," Grandmother Willow said, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the silent lodge. "I have seen our people suffer at the hands of white soldiers and settlers. I have buried sons and grandsons who died fighting to protect our way of life. But I have also learned that hatred and revenge are poisons that corrupt the soul of anyone who drinks from them." She paused, looking around the circle at each council member in turn. "These particular white people did not steal our lands or break our treaties. They are simply human beings in desperate need of help, and among them are children who are innocent of any crimes against our people." The old woman's words seemed to resonate with many of the council members, and Enola could see some of the initial hostility beginning to soften. But Thunderhorse was not yet convinced. "Even if we accept that these settlers deserve our compassion, what about the danger to our own people? If we help them, we make ourselves targets for the same outlaws who attack them. Are we willing to risk the lives of our own children to save the children of strangers?" Standing Bear rose to address the council, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was respected both as a warrior and as a wise leader. "My daughter has raised a question that goes to the very heart of who we are as a people. Our ancestors taught us that all life is sacred, that protecting the innocent is one of the highest callings a person can answer. If we turn our backs on these suffering people simply because they are white, how are we different from the white men who turn their backs on us because we are Indian?" The debate that followed was passionate and sometimes heated, with council members arguing from different perspectives about duty, safety, practical considerations, and moral obligations. Some pointed out that helping the survivors might improve relations with other white settlements in the area, potentially leading to better treatment for the Ponca people. Others worried that getting involved in conflicts between whites and outlaws might draw unwanted attention from the cavalry, who might not distinguish between Ponca helpers and Ponca enemies. As the discussion continued, Enola found herself thinking about the faces of the people she had left behind in the hidden valley. She thought about the young mother desperately trying to comfort her starving baby, about the children playing quiet games while their stomachs cramped with hunger, about the sick man whose wife bathed his fevered brow with water that might soon run out. The abstract arguments about policy and safety seemed almost irrelevant when weighed against the immediate reality of human suffering. Finally, Medicine Man Soaring Hawk stood to speak, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the lodge. As the village's most powerful spiritual leader, his words carried special weight in matters that involved the spirit world. "The girl speaks of a spirit horse that led her to these people," he said, his voice resonating with mystical authority. "This is not something to be dismissed lightly. The spirits do not send such signs without purpose. Perhaps they are testing us, asking us to prove that our compassion extends beyond the boundaries of our own tribe. The medicine man's interpretation of events seemed to shift the mood in the lodge, and Enola could sense that the tide of opinion was beginning to turn in favor of helping the survivors. But she knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to convince the council. She needed to appeal to their hearts as well as their minds, to make them understand that this was about more than just helping strangers. "Honored elders," Enola said, rising to address the council once more. "I know that what I'm asking is dangerous. I know that helping these people might bring trouble to our village. But I also know that if we don't help them, they will all die, including children who have never done anything to harm our people." When I looked into the eyes of that dying baby, I saw the same innocence I see in the eyes of our own children. How can we call ourselves protectors of the innocent if we only protect those who share our blood? Her words seemed to strike directly at the hearts of the council members, many of whom were parents and grandparents themselves. The image of children suffering and dying while capable adults debated the wisdom of helping them was one that resonated with the deepest parental instincts of everyone in the lodge. Even Thunderhorse, the most vocal opponent of intervention, seemed moved by her passionate plea. Chief Spotted Eagle stood slowly, his weathered face showing the weight of the decision he was about to make. "We have heard all the arguments, and now we must choose. Do we follow the safe path that protects only our own people, or do we follow the dangerous path that might save innocent lives at great risk to ourselves?" He looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of each council member. "I call for a vote. All those who believe we should help these survivors, stand." One by one, the members of the council rose to their feet, until only Thunderhorse and two other warriors remained seated. Even some of those who had initially expressed doubt had been swayed by the combination of spiritual significance, moral obligation, and the passionate advocacy of a 12-year-old girl who had risked everything to bring them this challenge. The decision was clear, though not unanimous. Standing Bear placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, his eyes shining with pride and concern in equal measure. "You have convinced the council to take this risk," he said quietly. "But now comes the difficult part. We must organize a rescue mission that can reach the survivors quickly while avoiding the outlaws who are hunting them. Are you prepared to guide us back to this hidden valley?" Enola nodded without hesitation, though her heart was racing with the realization that her words had set in motion events that could lead to either salvation or disaster for dozens of people on both sides. "The Copper Mare will lead us," she said with quiet confidence. "She brought me to them for a reason, and I believe she'll help us save them." As the council began to disperse, and the warriors started making plans for the rescue mission, Enola felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had convinced her people to risk everything for strangers, and now she would have to live with the consequences of that decision, whatever they might be. But as she thought about the desperate face waiting in the hidden valley, she knew that she had made the only choice her conscience would allow. Dawn broke over the Ponca village like a war cry, painting the eastern sky in shades of blood and gold, as 24 of the tribe's finest warriors prepared for what might be the most dangerous mission of their lives. The air was electric with tension and purpose as horses were saddled, weapons were checked, and supplies were loaded onto pack animals with the efficient urgency of people who understood that every moment of delay could mean the difference between salvation and catastrophe for the desperate souls waiting in the Badlands. Enola stood beside the Copper Mare, who had remained near the village throughout the night, as if understanding that her role in this unfolding drama was far from over. The magnificent horse seemed to glow in the early morning light, her coat reflecting the sunrise like burnished metal, and her intelligent eyes held a sense of anticipation that suggested she was eager to return to the hidden valley and complete the mission she had begun. Several of the warriors had commented on the horse's extraordinary beauty and obvious intelligence, and more than one had whispered, that they had never seen an animal that seemed so clearly touched by the spirit world. Standing Bear, many horses, moved through the group of warriors with the calm efficiency of a man who had led many dangerous expeditions, checking equipment and offering final instructions to each member of the rescue party. But Enola could see the tension in her father's shoulders and the worry lines around his eyes that spoke of a man who understood exactly how much could go wrong in the hours ahead. This wasn't just another hunting party or routine patrol. This was a mission that could bring deadly enemies down on their village if it went badly. "Remember," Standing Bear called out to the assembled warriors, his voice carrying clearly. In the crisp morning air, "We are not going to fight unless we have no choice. Our goal is to reach the survivors, assess their condition, and evacuate them to safety as quickly as possible. If we encounter the outlaw band, we avoid them if we can and fight only if we must. The lives of innocent people depend on our speed and discretion, not our courage in battle." War Chief Thunder Horse, despite his initial opposition to the Kamwa mission, had volunteered to lead the warrior contingent, and his presence gave the rescue party both tactical expertise and the kind of fierce determination that could make the difference between success and failure. He rode a powerful black stallion that seemed to match his own intimidating presence, and the other warriors clearly drew confidence from his leadership. "We'll split into 3 groups once we reach the Badlands," he announced, his deep voice carrying the authority of a seasoned military commander. "One group will establish a perimeter to watch for enemies, one will handle the evacuation of the survivors, and one will serve as rear guard to cover our retreat if necessary." Morning Star appeared at Enola's side, carrying a leather satchel filled with medical supplies and herbal remedies that might mean the difference between life and death for the sickest of the survivors. Her face showed the conflicted emotions of a mother who was proud of her daughter's compassion, but terrified of the dangers she was about to face. "Take these to the sick ones," she said, pressing the satchel into Enola's hands. "The willow bark tea will help with fever, the yarrow will stop bleeding, and the dried meat and pemmican will give strength to those who are starving. But promise me you'll stay close to your father and the other warriors. Don't take any unnecessary risks." Enola hugged her mother tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of sage and sweetgrass that always seemed to surround Morning Star like a protective aura. "I promise, Mother, but I have to go with them. The survivors trust me, and they'll be more likely to cooperate with the evacuation if they see a familiar face. Besides, the copper Mare will only follow me, and we need her to guide us back to the hidden valley." Her words carried a maturity and determination that made Morning Star's heart swell with pride, even as it clenched with fear. As the rescue party prepared to depart, Chief Spotted Eagle approached on foot, his ancient frame moving with the careful dignity of extreme old age. In his hands he carried a sacred war lance that had been blessed by generations of medicine men, its eagle feathers stirring in the morning breeze like whispers from the spirit world. "Enola, many horses," he said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "You have set in motion events that will echo through the generations. Whether those echoes speak of triumph or tragedy will depend on the wisdom and courage you show in the hours ahead. May the spirits of your ancestors guide your path and protect you from harm." The blessing from the chief sent a shiver through the assembled warriors, and Enola felt the full weight of spiritual significance settling over the mission like an invisible mantle. This was more than just a rescue operation. It was a test of the Ponca people's commitment to their highest values, a demonstration of whether they truly believed that all life was sacred, regardless of race or tribal affiliation. The ancestors would be watching, and their judgment would be based not just on the outcome of the mission, but on the spirit in which it was undertaken. With a final wave to the villagers who had gathered to see them off, the rescue party rode out of the village and toward the Badlands, the copper Mare leading the way with Enola on her back while the warriors followed in a loose formation that could quickly adapt to whatever threats they might encounter. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the sense of prairie grass and wildflowers. But as they rode deeper into the wilderness, those pleasant aromas gave way to the harsher smells of sage, alkali, and sun-baked stone that characterized the Badlands. The journey that had taken Enola hours to complete on foot the day before was covered much more quickly on horseback, but it still required careful navigation through terrain that could turn deadly without warning. The copper Mare seemed to know exactly where she was going, picking her way through narrow passages between towering rock formations and across unstable slopes where one wrong step could send horse and rider tumbling into hidden canyons. Several times the warriors had to dismount and lead their horses through particularly treacherous sections, but the Mare never hesitated or showed any uncertainty about the route. As they penetrated deeper into the Badlands, Thunder Horse began to notice signs that made his warrior's instincts scream warnings. "Fresh horse tracks," he called out, pointing to marks in the sandy soil that were no more than a few hours old. "Multiple riders, moving in a search pattern. They're definitely looking for something, and given what we know about the situation, I'd say they're closing in on the survivor's location." The discovery added a new urgency to the mission, transforming it from a rescue operation into a race against time. Standing Bear studied the tracks with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his life reading the signs left by both man and beast in the wilderness. "These are shod horses," he observed grimly, "which means they're not wild Mustangs. And the pattern suggests they're being ridden by people who know how to conduct a systematic search. We need to reach the hidden valley before these riders do, or we're going to find ourselves in the middle of a battle with innocent people caught in the crossfire." The copper Mare seemed to sense the increased urgency, and her pace quickened as she led the rescue party through a maze of canyons and rock formations that seemed designed by nature to confuse and disorient travelers. But the horse never wavered in her direction, never showed any doubt about where she was going, and her supernatural confidence began to inspire a similar feeling among the warriors who followed her. Even the most skeptical among them had to admit that this was no ordinary animal. When they finally reached the overlook above the hidden valley, the scene below was both heartening and alarming. The survivors were still alive and moving around their makeshift camp, which was encouraging, but there were also clear signs that their condition had deteriorated since Enola's visit the day before. Several people were lying motionless in the shelters, too weak to participate in the daily activities of survival, and the general level of activity in the camp suggested that desperation was beginning to overcome hope. But what truly sent alarm bells ringing through the rescue party was the sight of dust clouds on the horizon, moving steadily toward the hidden valley from the north. Someone was coming, and given the systematic search pattern Thunder Horse had observed, it was almost certainly the outlaw band that had been hunting the survivors. The rescue party had arrived just in time, but they were going to have to work fast if they wanted to evacuate the survivors before their enemies arrived. "We have maybe an hour," Thunder Horse announced grimly, studying the approaching dust clouds through a collapsible spyglass he had acquired in a trade with a cavalry officer years before. "Maybe less, depending on how fast they're traveling and whether they've spotted the valley yet. We need to get down there, organize the evacuation, and get everyone out of here before those riders arrive." The descent into the valley was harrowing, with warriors and horses picking their way down treacherous slopes while trying to maintain enough speed to beat the approaching deadline. Enola and the copper Mare led the way, the horse's supernatural agility allowing her to navigate the dangerous terrain much faster than any normal animal could have managed. Behind them, the Ponca warriors followed with grim determination, their faces set in the expressions of men who understood that failure would mean death for dozens of innocent people. When they reached the valley floor, the reaction from the survivors was immediate and overwhelming. Shouts of joy and relief echoed off the canyon walls as people who had given up hope suddenly found themselves face to face with salvation. Children ran toward the newcomers with tears streaming down their faces, while adults fell to their knees in gratitude and prayer. The scene was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a testament to the human capacity for hope even in the darkest circumstances. But there was no time for extended celebrations. Standing Bear immediately took charge of the evacuation, organizing the survivors into groups based on their physical condition and mobility. The sickest and weakest would be loaded onto the Ponca horses, while those who could still walk would have to make the journey on foot. It was a complex logistical challenge made even more difficult by the language barrier and the natural confusion that came with any large-scale emergency operation. Enola found herself serving as translator and liaison between the two groups, using her limited but functional English to convey instructions and reassurances to the survivors, while helping her father coordinate the evacuation effort. The young mother with the dying baby was among the first to be helped onto one of the horses, her face showing a mixture of gratitude and desperate hope as Morning Star's herbal medicines were administered to her starving child. The sick man, whom Enola had observed during her previous visit, was carefully lifted onto a makeshift stretcher that could be carried between two horses, his wife walking alongside and holding his hand while speaking words of encouragement that transcended language barriers. Other survivors gathered their few remaining possessions with the efficient speed of people who had learned to travel light, though many had to abandon items that had once seemed precious but now seemed insignificant compared to their lives. As the evacuation proceeded, scouts positioned on the canyon rim began to report increasingly alarming news about the approaching riders. "They've definitely spotted something," one warrior called down to the valley floor. "They're changing direction and heading straight for us. I count at least 15 riders, all armed and moving fast." The news sent a ripple of fear through both the survivors and their rescuers, and the pace of the evacuation increased to near frantic levels. Thunder Horse made a command decision that would determine the fate of everyone in the valley. "We can't get everyone out in time," he announced grimly. "Some of us are going to have to stay behind and buy time for the evacuation. I need volunteers for a rear guard action." Without hesitation, half the warriors stepped forward, their faces showing the kind of calm determination that comes from a lifetime of preparing for moments like this. But before the rear guard could be organized, the copper Mare suddenly reared up on her hind legs and released a sound that was unlike anything anyone had ever heard before. It was part whinny, part war cry, and part something else entirely. A sound that seemed to reach into the spirit world and call forth powers that existed beyond the realm of ordinary experience. The sound echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. In response to the Mare's call, the sound of approaching hoofbeats suddenly changed character. Instead of the steady rhythm of horses under human control, the sound became chaotic and panicked, filled with the whinnying of frightened animals and the shouts of confused riders. Through his spyglass, Thunder Horse could see that the outlaw band's horses had suddenly become unmanageable, bucking and rearing and refusing to obey their riders' commands. "The spirit horse," whispered one of the older warriors in amazement. "She's calling to their horses, turning them against their riders. I've heard stories of such things, but I never believed them until now." The supernatural intervention had bought them precious time, but everyone understood that it was only a temporary reprieve. The outlaws would eventually regain control of their mounts, and when they did, they would be furious and even more dangerous than before. With the extra time provided by the Copper Mare's intervention, the evacuation proceeded more smoothly, and within another 30 minutes, all the survivors had been loaded onto horses or organized into walking groups for the journey to safety. The sick and injured were carefully secured on the strongest horses, while the children were paired with Ponca warriors who could protect them during the difficult journey ahead. As the last of the survivors was helped out of the hidden valley, Enola took one final look at the place where 37 people had clung to life against impossible odds. The makeshift shelters and burned wagon remains bore silent testimony to human resilience and the will to survive. But they also served as a reminder of the violence and cruelty that had driven these people to such desperate circumstances. She whispered a prayer of gratitude to the spirits that had guided her to this place and allowed her to play a role in saving so many innocent lives. The copper Mare appeared at her side one last time, nuzzling her shoulder with the gentle affection that had become so familiar over the past 2 days. But as Enola looked into those ancient, wise eyes, she could sense that the horse's mission was nearly complete. The Mare had guided her to the survivors, had helped convince the Ponca people to risk everything for strangers, and had even used supernatural powers to protect the evacuation. Now it was up to human courage and determination to complete the journey to safety. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic rescue from the hidden valley, and the Ponca village had been transformed into something unprecedented in the history of the Great Plains. Where once there had been a single community of tribal dwellings, there now stood an integrated settlement where Ponca Tippa stood alongside hastily constructed log cabins, where the smoke of cooking fires carried the mingled aromas of traditional pemmican and frontier beans, and where children of 2 very different worlds played together in games that required no common language beyond laughter and imagination. The transformation had not been without its challenges. In those first chaotic days after the rescue, when 37 exhausted and traumatized survivors had arrived in the Ponca village, there had been moments of tension and misunderstanding that tested the goodwill of both communities. Language barriers had led to confusion about everything from food distribution to sleeping arrangements, and some members of both groups had struggled with prejudices and fears that ran deeper than their conscious desire for cooperation. But gradually, through patient effort and countless small acts of kindness, bridges had been built between 2 peoples who had every historical reason to distrust each other. The process had been facilitated by Enola, who had become an unofficial ambassador between the communities, and by leaders like Standing Bear and Jacob Hartwell, who understood that their people's survival might depend on their ability to work together in an increasingly dangerous territory. The sick man whom Enola had first seen lying fevered in the makeshift shelter had made a remarkable recovery under the care of Morning Star and the other Ponca medicine women. His name, she had learned, was Thomas McKenna, and he was a former schoolteacher from Missouri who had been traveling west with his wife Margaret in hopes of starting a new life in Oregon. The combination of traditional herbal remedies and careful nursing had not only saved his life, but had created a deep bond of gratitude and friendship between the McKenna family and their Ponca benefactors. The young mother with the starving baby had perhaps benefited most dramatically from the rescue. Her name was Rebecca Santos, and her infant son David had been literally hours away from death when the rescue party arrived. But under the care of Ponca women who understood the ancient arts of nurturing life, both mother and child had not only survived but thrived. Rebecca had learned to supplement her own milk with nutritious broths made from traditional recipes, and little David had grown plump and healthy, his laughter now a regular sound around the cooking fires. The integration had been made easier by the discovery that some of the settlers possessed skills that were desperately needed by the Ponca community. Jacob Hartwell himself was a master carpenter whose knowledge of construction techniques had helped the village build more durable and weather-resistant structures. Sarah Thompson, the woman who had first spoken with Enola during the rescue, turned out to be an experienced seamstress whose ability to work with both traditional and modern fabrics had revolutionized the community's approach to clothing and blankets. But perhaps the most important factor in the successful integration had been the children. While adults struggled with language barriers and cultural differences, the young people of both communities had found ways to communicate and play together that transcended those obstacles. Enola had become particularly close to Annie Hartwell, Jacob's 10-year-old daughter, who had shown remarkable resilience in recovering from the trauma of the wagon train attack. Together, they had created games that combined Ponca and settler traditions, and their friendship had become a symbol of hope for the entire community. The threat from the outlaw band had not entirely disappeared, but it had been significantly reduced by events that still seemed almost miraculous to those who had witnessed them. After the supernatural intervention by the Copper Mare had disrupted their horses and prevented them from reaching the hidden valley in time, the renegades had apparently given up their search for survivors and moved on to easier targets elsewhere in the territory. Occasional scouting reports suggested that they were now operating much farther south, terrorizing settlements along the Arkansas River. The Copper Mare herself had remained near the village for several days after the rescue, as if ensuring that the integration process would proceed smoothly. But gradually, she had begun to spend more time ranging across the surrounding prairie, and Enola had understood that the magnificent horse's mission was nearing its completion. The Mare had served as a bridge between the world of spirits and the world of flesh, bringing together two communities that needed each other more than they had initially realized. On this particular morning, as autumn colors began to paint the prairie grass in shades of gold and amber, Enola stood at the edge of the village watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky. Beside her stood Annie Hartwell, whose presence had become as natural and comfortable as that of her own brother. The two girls had been inseparable since the day of the rescue, their friendship serving as a living example of the bonds that could form when people looked beyond surface differences to the common humanity beneath. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Annie asked, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the Copper Mare, who had saved her life and the lives of everyone she loved. The horse had not been seen for 3 days now, and both girls sensed that her departure might be permanent this time. "I mean, I know she's a spirit horse and all, but I kind of hoped she would stay with us forever." Enola smiled as she considered the question, her own eyes searching the distant hills where the Mare had last been spotted. "I think she'll always be with us in a way," she said thoughtfully. "Maybe not where we can see her, but in the connection she helped create between our peoples. Every time someone from your community and someone from mine work together or help each other, she's there in spirit." The philosophical conversation was interrupted by the sound of excited voices from the center of the village, where a crowd was gathering around what appeared to be an impromptu celebration. The girls ran toward the commotion and discovered that Rebecca Santos and her baby David were at the center of attention, surrounded by women from both communities who were exclaiming over something that had apparently just been announced. "What's happening?" Enola asked her mother, who was standing near the edge of the crowd with a broad smile on her face. Morning Star's eyes were bright with joy as she turned to answer her daughter's question. "Rebecca has just announced that she and Thomas McKenna are planning to be married next month. They want to hold the ceremony here in our village with both Ponca and Christian traditions represented in the service." The news sent a ripple of excitement through both communities, as it represented not just a personal celebration, but a symbolic union between two cultures that had found a way to coexist peacefully. The marriage would create the first truly mixed family in their integrated settlement, and the ceremony itself would serve as a demonstration of how different traditions could be woven together into something beautiful and meaningful. As the day progressed, Enola found herself reflecting on all the changes that had occurred since that morning 3 weeks ago, when she had first followed the Copper Mare into the Badlands. Her own role in the community had evolved considerably, as she had become a recognized leader among the children and a trusted translator between the adult communities. But more importantly, she had learned lessons about courage, compassion, and the importance of acting on one's convictions, even when the risks seemed overwhelming. That evening, as the village settled into its nightly routine, Standing Bear approached his daughter where she sat by the family fire, working on a beadwork project that combined traditional Ponca patterns with designs she had learned from the settler women. His face showed the kind of paternal pride that needed no words to communicate, but he spoke anyway, his voice carrying the weight of deep emotion. "Daughter, I want you to know that what you accomplished 3 weeks ago has changed not just the lives of those 37 people you saved, but the entire future of our community. You have shown us that courage doesn't always mean fighting with weapons, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from extending our hands in friendship rather than raising them in war." Enola looked up from her beadwork, meeting her father's gaze with eyes that had gained wisdom and maturity far beyond her 12 years. "I just did what felt right, Father. The spirit horse showed me people who needed help, and I couldn't turn away from them. But it was you and the other elders who made the truly brave decision to risk everything to save strangers." Standing, Bear shook his head with a gentle smile. "We made that decision because you convinced us it was the right thing to do. Your courage gave us the strength to overcome our fears and prejudices. That is the mark of a true leader, someone who can inspire others to be better than they thought they could be." As if summoned by their conversation about courage and leadership, a familiar sound drifted across the prairie, causing both father and daughter to look toward the horizon with sudden attention. It was the sound of a horse's whinny, but not just any horse. This was the distinctive call of the copper mar, a sound that had become as recognizable to the entire community as the voice of an old friend. There, silhouetted against the star-filled sky on the same ridge where Enola had first spotted her 3 weeks ago, stood the magnificent horse that had changed all their lives. Her coat seemed to glow in the moonlight, and her proud bearing spoke of a creature that existed somewhere between the physical world and the realm of spirits. But as Enola watched, she could sense that this was a farewell appearance, a final blessing from the Mare before she returned to whatever mysterious realm had sent her. The horse remained on the ridge for several minutes, long enough for word of her appearance to spread through the village and draw dozens of people outside to witness what they somehow understood would be their last glimpse of their supernatural benefactor. Then, with a final whinny that seemed to carry the voices of all the ancestors who had ever watched over the Ponca people, the copper mare turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only the memory of her presence and the enduring legacy of the miracle she had made possible years later, when Enola had grown into a respected leader who helped guide her people through the changing times that came with the settlement of the American West. She would still tell the story of the copper mare and the hidden valley where 37 souls had been saved from certain death. The tale would become one of the most beloved legends of the integrated community that grew from that original village, passed down through generations as a reminder that courage and compassion could overcome even the deepest prejudices and fears. And sometimes, on clear autumn mornings when the light struck the prairie just right, children playing at the edge of the settlement would claim to see a copper-colored horse running free across the distant hills, her mane flowing like liquid fire in the wind. Whether these sightings were real or imaginary, they served as a constant reminder that some spirits never truly leave us, that some miracles echo through time long after their creators have moved on to other missions in other worlds. The little Ponca girl who had chased a wild Mare at dawn had indeed discovered a secret in the Badlands that shocked everyone. But the greatest shock had been the realization that enemies could become friends, strangers could become family, and that sometimes the most extraordinary adventures begin with nothing more than the courage to follow where our hearts lead us, even when we don't know where that path might end.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.